Let's take just a few moments to look at the fourth order bandpass enclosure. There's a couple of things that's required in a fourth order that's you can't skimp. One is a suitable sub, space, and then specs. Those are the three things. So we're going to look at those real quick. A suitable sub, you've got to make sure that you have a sub that will perform in a sealed enclosure. The best way that I have found to go about it is go on the manufacturer's website and see if they offer a sealed recommendation or spec for an enclosure. If they offer a sealed spec for their enclosure, very likely it's going to be a suitable sub for a fourth order, because there's two chambers in a fourth order. There's the ported and the sealed, and you've got to be able to have a sub that'll play in the sealed section. If not, then it's all for nothing. So a suitable sub, what you look for is a progressive roll spider. Other than just what's on the manufacturer's site, you can look through the specifications, and from my understanding, chime in if there's something more, something less. But when I was researching and building my fourth, the progressive roll spider was king. A lot of spiders, or some spiders, are just the same kind of repeating roll, but the progressive roll spider actually changes, not height wise, but the width of it, and it allows for a different experience inside of the subwoofer. So you've got to have that progressive roll spider, so it's a suitable sub. You got to have space also. I see people do a 2-to-1. I've seen a 1-to-1, and that means the sealed section that's the one, and then the ported section is going to be 2 times larger, 3 times larger, whatever it is. So if it's a 1-to-2, then the sealed section is 1 cube. Let's use 1 cube. Then the ported would be 2. That's a 1-to-2 ratio. A 1-to-3 would be 1 cube sealed, 3 cubes ported. That's what I like, because I like the lows. Do whatever you have space for. That's what we're talking about. What kind of space do you have? Can you do a 3-to-1? If you're doing 2 15s that require, 8 cubes, I'd put them in 10, but if it requires 8 cubes, do you have 24 cubes to do a 1-to-3? Are you going to have to do 16 and do a 1-to-2? So space factors in very much so with a fourth order, just because the need for space is greater to achieve your goals. So I always do a 3-to-1. I like that ported side 3 times the size of the sealed side. And here's the next thing, and we'll talk about that in specs. The main thing about and I was very fortunate that the guy that I bought my subs from, the DC XL18s, he had done the footwork, the legwork on figuring out what that sub worked best in on the sealed side. Because if you screw the sealed section up, it's done. It's just not ever going to perform. Make it larger, but not smaller. If you make it larger, you can stack 2x4s inside of it and actually seal it, shrink it down. So make it larger, not smaller. Make it larger, not smaller, so that you can seal it down. That's the main thing. A lot of people make the sealed section too small, and then you can never achieve your goals, because the natural ability for a subwoofer to create low frequencies comes from the sealed section. It'll play naturally by itself, infinite baffle, don't misunderstand me. But when you put it in a sealed section, that brings out its natural abilities to perform low frequencies. So it's essential that, and I always build a test box with the sealed side to run it in the vehicle, at least one sub, to see how it's going to perform. Is it going to perform low frequencies? Is it not? Is it going to bottom out? Is it going to be too compressed and not perform at all? So do a sealed section, 1 cube, 2 cubes, whatever you think is going to perform well. And that's where that manufacturer spec also comes in. See what they recommend in the sealed side. See what they recommend. I always go larger than the manufacturer, because the manufacturer cheats it to be safe. That's up to you and your system to determine. That's what I do. So look and see what they recommend on it, and that's a good starting point for me. Go larger than that. That way you can, like I say, stack 2x4s on it inside of it and decrease the size. Do the math on a 2x4 3.5 by 1.5 inches, by however, by a foot's what I do with them. Stack those, multiply by 1728, it'll tell you the airspace. Make you a cube of those, put it in there, see what it does. Shrink it down, see how it works. But that's the space that's required for the actual performance of it. Imagine doing 2 enclosures hooked together, you know what I'm saying? Because that's what it is. I mean, you've got your sealed section, and then we talk about a 3-to-1, so somewhere thereabouts, right? So that takes up a heck of a lot of space when you're laying that down in the back of a trunk of a car, right? So you got to have that space right. It's got to have the space to do that 3-to-1. You got to have a good sub to put in it that's going to work. And now that we're on that, let's talk about that for a second. I always put the cone firing into the sealed section, motor out. You can say, oh, set it DD1, all this stuff. Listen, if you got a port right here, and that sub, you're pushing that sub and it starts stinking, you know to turn it down a little bit. If you've got that ass or a motor over into the sealed section of it, if it starts stinking, where's it going? I mean, it's likely just done. So do yourself a favor, flip that thing around. Another thing, while we're talking about it, when I built mine to where the sealed sections were all independent of each other. Those look nothing like speakers. And it worked out great. I was at a competition one time, and the amp for this set went out. I was running strap sets, and I competed still yet with those two. And that made it probably closer to a 4-to-1 or a 3.5-to-1 or, you know, whatever. But it did like a 52 on 2 of them, though. I was super impressed with that. But anyway, it was a 55 setup, so one down, it made a big difference. But anyway, back to the space. I always do that. I recommend that, the separate sections, and keeping the motor into the ported section. That way you smell anything if it starts coming undone. So the specs, we've kind of already talked about that a little bit. You want to make sure that you do that test. You want to make sure that you've got your ratio correct on what you want to do as far as the box goes, how much space you've got. Then build an enclosure or spec out an enclosure, design an enclosure that's going to meet all of those needs and that's going to perform the way that you want it to. Now, I showed you guys this on the last one, and I'm not really going to go into it, but go into your port calculator. We look at a slot port as that, right? So on a 4th order, when you're doing your tune on the port, you've got to look at it a little bit differently. Instead of wanting, I do a 3-inch port. So instead of wanting it 3 inches wide, right, you want to do it 3 inches thick. Or I'm sorry, 3.5 inches thick. That way you can stack 2x4s onto it to be able to accomplish getting your tuning right. When you end up doing your tuning wall, if you do your port large, like that, instead of being 3 inches wide, it's probably going to be 25 inches wide or something. And that's what's really weird to us when we go in the port calculator and we go 25 wide, and you know, it's usually around 18 tall, somewhere around there. And then as far as the length of it, I'm sorry, I was struggling for that a while ago. As far as the length of it, it's only going to be 3.5. And you got to just keep playing in the port calculator. The old port calculator that we love so much. You've got to go in there and just keep manipulating the actual width, the port width and the port height until you get it to where the port length and the frequency, obviously, until you get the port length to 3.5. When you get the port length to 3.5, that means that's the width of a 2x4. That means once you get that port opening where you want it to be, you can stack 2x4s. And you see that, you'll see that on my build. You stack 2x4s that way to shrink the port. And I also did them this way too, because I mean, it's 3.5. You know what I'm saying? It's 3.5. So that's how you end up shrinking your port. You just got to go into that port calculator, keep messing with the height and the width and the frequency of that you want until you get the length of that port to 3.5 inches. Then that lets you stack it. That gives you what you need to get to on your specs. That allows that ported and that sealed to come together. And that's how it works, right? I mean, we've kind of talked around it. But the sealed section performs the low frequencies inside of the enclosure, inside of that 3 part of the chamber that you created. That sealed section fires into that 3 section, the ported section of the enclosure. And when it does, those low frequencies come out the port already tuned. So your port's going to tune what's inside of what's being created inside of that chamber, but those low frequencies are going to come out as they are. So having said that, I usually tune my port, and I tune mine to 40. A lot of the people do 45. I'd probably do mine to 35 today, to be honest with you, with a bigger sealed section to create more lows. But that's horse for a different color. I'll put in the beginning of this the 4th order that I built with Jeremy Williams' help, who's here on the page, and that guy's just a wizard of it. It's I know a lot of what I know because of him. I'll just put it that way. So that's kind of how it works in a nutshell. Create it, build it, design it, find a suitable sub for it, get the right space of what you can. And I tell you what, I would sacrifice one sub over space if I don't have the space for it, instead of cramming it into one small little spot. A lot of people these days are like cramming a lot of cone area into a small space and throwing power at it. And I tell you, their 20 hertz sounds a whole lot different than my 20 hertz. It might register the same on the meter, but it sounds a whole lot different. I'll take those big wide open frequencies. That's what you get with those low tune and big spaces. But that's enough for this one. This will get you where you need to be. Find you a good sub. Find a space that you can get it in. Find the spec of the box. This is enough to get you there. Get you tune it, or put the ass out. Get your port tuned right. Start stacking it. Get it down to where you want it to be, and go out there and bang it, because it's going to.